Okay, this recording is going to be a very annoying catalogue of things, some things that are more tenuous and more interesting than other things, but I guess this is just a general update of where I am theorizing on trying to finish the model of the integration of metatype and metagram. So the first thing that I was trying to do was just find elements within metatype that are good extractions that summarize an entire type, and that, just as a kind of, as an easier way to present the model to people in a way that it becomes tangible and useful to them. And this led me to thinking that it would probably be good for me to work on better describing the components of the stimulus, the primary counteroffer, and the emergent response, being things like the devotion and the declaration are the two components of the stimulus, the answer and the prayer, and the worship and the oath. And that also got me thinking, if there are certain metatype extractions that are good shorthands to connecting to, let's say, the themes that are the greater significance of these metagram elements, which are already sort of overlaid onto metatype. And, so basically I was trying to find a way, if there was a nice way that essentially being able to describe these things, the stimulus, the primary counteroffer, and the emergent response, through the superego, into sort of rooting it into the superego. And that sort of teased the whole subject open for me to sort of invent some new jargon, which I think brings some clarity to just these concepts themselves. And it also led me sort of down a rabbit hole as to the two separate issues of self-actualization, or the two separate, and this is a distinction which has been outlined in Scientology, that there's, for example, that you need to clear up the charge that's sitting on your case, but you also need to conceptually clear up the general problem in the abstract, in some sense, that you have to understand how to be a Theta Claire in terms of just conceptually almost, and understand then that you have a particular kind of case and a particular kind of charge that's sitting on your case that needs to be particularly cleared up. So you kind of have to be able to heal yourself in the categorical sense of just the general understanding of it all, and in the particular sense of understanding your particular issue, as it were, and sort of dispelling that particular self-abuse, essentially, or impingement against one's self-determinism. Anyway, I think that I came to some clarity on that in terms of how, so I'm going to talk through that as well. And then this led me on to thinking on a further problem, which I don't have a solution to, which is still trying to find a way to explain what exactly the differences are between Satwa, Rajas, and Tamas. Because empirically I have, and this is unverified, so I always take this with a pinch of salt, and I'm always trying to find a basis for this. And I'm going to speculate as to what the basis might be, so this is just why I'm bringing this up. Is that the difference between Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas is that within their own particular cognitive stack, they have a different pecking order, they have a different chain of cognition in terms of where their starting anchor point is, and then so their thinking flows from a starting point. So everyone uses the same sequence, and I don't have it in front of me, but again, this was sort of empirically laid out, that I empirically tracked this, that People, I'm just going to make it up because I don't have it in front of me, but that there's first people cognite in terms of the worship, which then follows the devotion, which then follows the answer, which then follows the declaration. It has a particular sequence, but people start at a different point in that chain. And I don't know, I want to find an explanation for that, which I haven't found yet. But what the explanation might be is that when you actually look at the emotional tones used by a particular metagram type, you might find that when you overlay their metatype and their metagram type, that it all hinges on the oath or something like that. And so whatever the emotional tone inflection is in the oath or in the emergent response, let me just call it that, or actually there's maybe good reason just to call it the one or the other, the oath or the worship, because these things might not have the same emotion if it's a double circuit, because I still haven't fully hammered out exactly how double circuits operate, if they operate in the alternative or if they always operate simultaneously, or if there's a selection that it can go one way or the other way. But if it's more than one, they will have the same elemental makeup, the same elemental constituency in terms of the alchemical element. Anyway, that actually the emergent response can have more than one. So it's only the primary counteroffer that only has, in my model, only a single emotional response. So maybe it all centers around the primary counteroffer, because then there could be no possible ambiguity, at least in the speculation that I'm raising at this point, is that once you get the initial emotional response that then the metagram circuit then is perhaps grafted around, is that sort of puts you at a particular place, virtually speaking, in the 17 stack. That means that you've got two emotional tones, you've got two cognitive functions in the 17 stack making up a single emotional tone. And they're going to be positioned somewhere in the 17 stack. And either in combination with the metatype or in combination with the other emotional tones, which then join the metagram chain, there's going to be a kind of some kind of geometrical pattern or some kind of rule that is going to be consistent. And there's going to be some kind of perhaps procedural or sequitur motion or something like that. So, and that's going to mean that going from one emotional tone to the next emotional tone is going to sort of take you in one direction relative to the one constituent of the emotional tone to the next constituent of the emotional tone. And so that's going to sort of lead a particular kind of order. And if you, again, because this is sort of virtually over, because you can put metatype as an overlay on the 17 stack, and then you can also put the emotional tone constituents themselves, the ingredients, the cognitive functions that make up the emotional tones, also as an overlay onto the metatype. That somehow there's going to be a kind of possible moves, that there's going to be some kind of formulaic or geographical sort of sequitur in some mechanical sense, there's going to be a way in which essentially it's only possible to move from one to the next, to the next, to the next. And maybe there's some ambiguity where you could go backwards before forwards again. Like you could sort of so you could go from the devotion to the prayer, to the worship, to the declaration. I know that the answer in the prayer actually is in the sequence that I found is always one follows the other one. Okay, wait. Let me just take a second and back up and apologize for this kind of post hoc reasoning and somewhat properly excuse it, because I do think that this is sort of necessary. Like, one of the things that sort of I am thinking out loud to some extent, and doing my theorizing in real time, but the reason why it was necessary to sort of to solve these problems at the same time, essentially, is because and you know, in some sense there might be some elements in terms of the actual the flow that I apparently observed when empirically mapping metagram between these elements of metagram circuitry having this particular order. That might be like a mechanical thing that I need to properly get to grips with and work out the kinds of models that can actually, from metatype, that can support that kind of structure, just to get some kind of, to see if I can get something that conforms to those rules and that gives some kind of general explanatory power. But the reason why it's fundamentally tricky, and why I have all these other embarrassing caveats to make about sort of not knowing about if the emotional tones, when there's a double circuit, how those emotional tones are represented, is because in some sense I think that the emotional tones themselves are not the identity that the false ego complex is actually driving. That in some sense the false ego complex is not using emotional tones, it's using symbols that can, in the in types that use double circuits or have more than one circuit, more than one emotional tone, that symbolic representation or represents more than one emotional tone. And that's because essentially the false ego complex can't use emotional tones directly, because the emotional tones are in some sense a lived experience, to say something like that. They are alive, they are actually cognitively done, and they are done in particular, but how they are ushered in by the false ego complex, how they are mechanically driven, that's more of a kind of habitual activity. So the false ego complex is not is a kind of habitual pattern. It's not it doesn't actually use the psychology directly, although in single circuit people you can maybe make that conflation, because there's no ambiguity in terms of the emotional tone that it will elicit into use. And in some sense, I think that you could make the claim, perhaps, that all false ego complexes are somewhat housed within a corruption of the water, the fourth dimension of psychological reality. That there are nations polluting the water and divvying up the symbols into kind of metaphorically national categorization of various nationalisms, and so and which are essentially these imagined categories that are so you have these kind of idolatry national so that's almost to use the word notional, but essentially that the symbol matrix within the water is conforming. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, but this leads on to other subjects that I was going to go into. But anyways, but so in some sense, I think that the false ego complex is made up of these water figments, or these kind of symbolic modes of habits. So it's a kind of symbolic identity which is being interfaced with and projected onto life, and therefore it's being governed by a kind of water matrix. So in some sense, I think that the whole false ego complex can be reduced to some kind of almost symbolic behaviorism, although that's a bit of an oxymoron. And that symbolic behaviorism can somewhat be cashed out into alchemical elements on some level. And so there's a false 12 model of karma, as opposed to the 17 model of the actual living experience of the cognitive functions. There's a false experience of the cognitive functions, which are essentially put into a kind of set of nations and symbolic. Anyway, so because of that sort of those extra conflations which exist within the 12 model, when you are in some sense filtering the 12 model through 4 alchemical symbols, you get a certain set of what each particular, within the 17 model, or within the metatype overlay of the 17 model, you're going to have 2 or 3 dimensions that essentially are responsible for producing the answer in the superego, and then all the other sides of the mind are going to have 2 dimensions. It's always the dominant and the parent function. In the superego, it perhaps includes the child function as well, that go into, so for example, the dominant function and the parent function of the subconscious is going to be responsible for the worship and the declaration. And I guess when I say responsible, I'm also being ambiguous there, because in some sense, it's more responsible for the worship, and the declaration is something that it has more latitude, probably, in terms of I've created jargon that means that, for example, that the worship is a conforming activity that it's doing, and the declaration is an informing activity that it's doing relative to its own foundation of its own side of the mind. And the informing, in some sense, validation or verification of its of what the other side, of what some other side of the mind is conforming to. So it's setting the table. Anyway, those are I need to explore that separately and talk about those things, because those are very interesting, and that leads to new therapeutic kind of important things to focus on. but essentially between the dominant function or the parent function in the metatype overlay, one of those dimensions will be one of the 12 ingredients, which has one of these alchemical symbolic elements of it. And so there will always be an ingredient within within each side of the mind, which will be part of this conflated, symbolic, watery, groove system of habitual modes. And so when all of these things are reduced down into a set of cognitive functions, or possible cognitive functions because of the ambiguity of the symbols, there's going to be some kind of natural pecking order when you overlay that ambiguity back onto a 17 model as to which one is going to be prime or which one is going to take precedence and sort of be the starting point in the chain, or the strongest point to start from. And then that will correspond back to which side of the mind essentially takes the lead. You know, like Tamasic individuals are unconscious, are kind of unconscious focused. Sattvic individuals are subconscious focused, and Rajasic individuals are ego focused. Or when I say focused, I mean that their metagram, according to my empirically observed things, that's where their starting point in the chain begins. But the starting point perhaps is not that relevant, because the second point in the chain is often in another place. So it goes, from, I can't remember exactly how the order goes. I can't remember if it starts always with an informing or a conforming. But if it's the oath, then it goes something like oath, declaration, answer prayer, devotion, worship. I think is the sequence is something like that, and then people start at a different, depending if they're Satwa, Rajas, or Tamas, they start at a different beginning point. Anyway, so this is quite embarrassing. I'm trying to post hoc work out a model that fits this. This is just a kind of very sort of dry, almost technical speculation, and it's I might have made some kind of clerical error while I'm just kind of talking about this outside. But anyway, they're just in toying with this slightly, or before toying with this segment of what I've just been talking about. Just going back to the theme of needing to be Theta Claire and then needing to actually deal with the actual charge in your actual case. And somewhat going back to the issue of informing and conforming. So, it really opened my mind, or it opened my eyes to the fact that I've not explained these things well in my recordings, and I haven't really spoken about them. In terms of the devotion, the oath, the worship, the declaration. But now that I've got a metatype model that has them positioned nicely on top of it, so the weird thing is that these things, the devotion, the oath, the worship, the prayer, all those things, they all come from dominant and parent functions. And that a pair of dominant and parent functions within one side of the mind, maybe the exception being the superego, it also includes the child function. So it potentially also includes the child function. I see no reason not to include the child function, but that's such a kind of unique circumstance that it might not be important really to mention, but generally speaking, because in some sense, even if it does include the child function, it has to go through the dominant function and go through the parent function anyway. So these things they can't operate independently. The point of including the child function, like in some sense, none of them operate independent of the child function, but what makes it worthy to just say that it's the dominant function, the parent function, and the other sides of the mind is because the child function is double bound between two sides of the mind, whereas the dominant and the parent function are unique to that side of the mind. They are unilateral to that side of the mind. They're not double bound. They don't have other responsibilities. The superego is the exception to this, is that the child function of the superego doesn't have another responsibility. So it is independently able to act in conjunction with the others. So in some sense, its actual piece of the puzzle matters because it doesn't have to be bogged down by confusion, essentially. So each side of the mind, generally speaking, their dominant function, their parent function, are free to act. They're free to choose how they act. So they have a kind of independent latitude, and that's why I single them out that way. They still, in some sense, have a general responsibility to their local child function, but that's also sort of a slight poison pill because that local child function is also, all this, I don't want to repeat all this stuff, but essentially, because the local child function is also the sin of the prior side of the mind. So the previous side of the mind is trying to ignore the child function of the next side of the mind because it's very painful to it. And this is symbolized by the inferior function of the previous side of the mind. And so the inferior function is trying to put up a firewall, a fire break, and sort of jettison the sin, which then becomes the child function of the preceding side of the mind. And so the dominant function and the parent function have to sort of adopt this child function and have to dignify it, have to sort of dress it up, and have to try to conserve its positive value that it's trying to craft around that. Now, it does this by setting up its own barrier against the prior side of the mind's inferior function. It has to do something. It has to inform. It has to make a prayer or a declaration or an oath informing the inferior function of the last side of the mind that you're not an inferior function of the last side of the mind, you are the foundation of this side of the mind. And that is done through what I have titled the prayer, the oath, the declaration. These are informing or informed identity projection that is placed on the prior side of the mind's inferior function to become a foundation. Now, that, I guess I'm still playing with this jargon slightly, but that informed role is really quite powerful, and it's in some senses much more rigid and direct relative to the other thing that it does, which is the conforming thing that is being done. And the conforming thing that is being done, which is that same parent and child function, that same parent and dominant function, after it has made a kind of informed thing, and when I say it's not really necessarily in metagram the next thing that happens, it maybe happens down after other things have happened first. The only exception being the answer in the prayer. is that those things do follow in sequence, but actually, because I don't have it in front of me, I'm not sure if it's the answer or the prayer that happens first. Man, I should actually look that up. I'm not. That's a bit stupid that I don't have that in front of me. Is it the answer or the prayer that always happens first? Because anyway, yeah. So I mean, just to know if it's the conforming or the informing thing that starts off the chain, because it's different in each. It's different for Satwa, Rajas, and Tamas. It's a different starting point, but the starting point is always the same in terms of informing or conforming. I don't have my notes, that part of my notes in front of me. Actually, I could. This is why I wanted a paper holder. Come on. Where is it? Come on. Are these notes too old? Really not. Okay, swap a minute. Here it is. Devotion, worship, answer. It's just conforming. So it's conforming as first. Okay. Okay, so it starts off always as conforming. Okay. So that means that for a Tamas individual, it'll always be the answer and then the prayer. Anyway, the answer and the prayer is very important. I think the answer to the prayer. Okay, where do I start this? Okay, so the subconscious. Sorry, not the subconscious. The super ego, child, dominant, and parent function is producing the answer, which is a conforming. A conforming. It's conforming to the foundation of the unconscious side of the mind. So the superego's parent function is conforming to the foundation of the unconscious the unconscious side of the mind, or the foundation of the unconscious side of the mind, which is in some sense conforming to what perhaps has already been set up in a prior cycle, in a prior cycling of the emotional tone circuitry, which obviously, the first time that this happens, it's always weird the first time. When someone is entering their metagram circuitry for the very, very, very first time, it's very strange because they're doing it naively, and it's very weird how people, I think, sort of induct themselves into it, because there isn't yet a cycle of which to anticipate what's happening next. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that. That's almost like a phenomenological thing, but that's a very interesting thing, because that's something that has to be probably revisited when escaping the matrix of the false ego complex. You kind of have to remember that kind of strange stuff that happened when you were entering into the mesogram circuit for the first time. But anyway, so you conform to the prayer, essentially, or you conform to the foundation of the unconscious side of the mind, and then the dominant and parent function of the unconscious side of the mind is producing an informed identity. Now, the answer in the prayer is going to be the same emotional tone. I don't know if I can even say that I have proven this empirically, because perhaps it was more of a theoretical thing, that I just assumed that you could only ever have one emotional tone in the primary counteroffer, which is the answer and the prayer. Although I have kind of broken that in terms of bipolar, where I've actually said what is causing a lot of bipolar symptoms is what I call a virtual second primary counteroffer, which is what causes essentially the identity to be ripped apart. And also because essentially you end up creating sympathetically an ulterior subconscious, and then all of your framework for all of your knowledge and all of your beliefs essentially fall apart. They become atomized, and you have to collect them amidst new frameworks, which are being structured in the ulterior subconscious habitual mode. But anyway, let me not jump around too much. Okay, so so there's one emotional tone here. Now this emotional tone is, I think, in some sense, very stable and somewhat toxic, because this stands by itself. Like, this stands in its own separate kind of circuit. The primary counteroffer, with its superego, child dominant and parent function, and its unconscious dominant and parent function, are producing then other things as well. The unconscious dominant and parent function is producing the question, which is conforming to the ego's inferior function. So the answer and the prayer produces conformity to the inferior functions, the ego's inferior function, which is why the ego's inferior function is the only free source of free theta in the whole false ego complex. It is the tone arm. It is the thing that actually has the freedom to see what's going on. So you are kind of, the seat of your responsibility is all located within the ego's inferior function. That is the only freedom that you really have in a deep existential sense. And then on the other side, the superego's child dominant and parent function is creating what I call the just if, or the just itself, sorry. Or I think I used to call it the only itself, or anyway, I had other names for it. I sometimes do call it the just if, but here I call it the just itself. And that is the informed foundation of itself, which it doesn't have to do. It can inform whatever it wants to there. It doesn't have any counterbalancing, countervailing thing, because the question and the just itself they don't overlap. So this is the asymmetry. So essentially the primary counteroffer is the strongest. Primary counteroffer, which is negotiated between the superego and the unconscious, the independent modes between the superego and the unconscious are, and I actually want to say that the answer is not as important as the prayer. The prayer is much more important, because the prayer is now it's weird, because you can try to alter the one by altering the other. Like, if you change what you're conforming to, you can through almost a kind of behaviorism, you can undermine the informed identity, or the informed habitual use of the foundation. So you can, by gradient scale, by altering the conformity, you can change the information that structures the foundation. But ideally what you would want is this whole circuit, which is a kind of broken circuit, I think can either be regarded as being headed by the superego, or being headed by the inferior function in the ego. Those are kind of at the top, at the apex. but in some sense, you can only kind of care about that if you can also, you have to actually control the whole thing to some degree, or you have to have a hand in the whole thing, but you have to integrate it towards responsibility, towards the ego's inferior function. But you have to do that through the prayer and the answer. And in some sense, you have to be conscious of the prayer so that you can actually work against it and choose it rather by changing the answer. So you change the conformity and then you end up making the prayer malleable. And if the prayer is malleable enough, then the inferior function in the ego becomes fully awakened. And the question, the freedom, the actual existential freedom that the inferior function has will naturally transmit itself into a condition of the prayer and a condition of the answer. Now, the other thing that I didn't mention there is the superego with its just itself. And this is something that I think can only be solved by meta-ethics in some sense. Like, this is almost philosophy. This is all the issues of being a Theta Claire are symbolized in this circuit. And it is the weirder one because it doesn't conform to itself. It doesn't loop back around. It has a beginning and it has an end. It has a start and it has a finish. And they don't loop back. It doesn't loop back into itself. So you can actually manage this and get this into a state where it has, let's say, a stable internal locus of control. It has a fundamentally clear edifice and platform for seeing what's going on. Okay, so anyway, that's fine, I think. So if you solve this, you don't solve the problem of self-actualization, but you do kind of solve it in the abstract, in the generalized sense. So you do fix things, I think, quite well. And I think that this is actually when it talks in Revelations about that the one head of the beast is damaged and weakened or maimed. That this is the head of the beast that gets damaged. It's essentially the primary counter offer, which is essentially the foundation of the unconscious side of the mind. This is the point at which you can actually bring down the beast, as it were, of the false ego complex. And the hardest part is, in some sense, is the super ego, because you have to, because that's quite veiled to you, and it does have a lot of problems involved in it. Sort of the I would tend to think that that's where the spirit of the false prophet and the dragon and the beast is kept within the child dominant and parent function of the superego. Oh. So those have to sort of come out of the mouth like frogs. Anyway, the thing, yeah. So the thing that makes this circuit so weird is because of the question and the just itself, because those I don't even include in the metagram model. They don't even fit in the metagram model, and that's because in some sense the question is always there. The question is the free attention that you have in your mind to think about anything. It is the free hand you have in your ego. But the just itself is quite the opposite of that. It's like the hidden foundation of, well, it's the thing that's producing the answer, but it's also producing the just itself. And I do think that generally the solution to this is that you do need to bridge that gap. That what being a Theta Claire is that you need the inferior function of the ego to stop is to not sort of care about the courtship that it's getting from the unconscious side of the mind in terms of the conformity that it's getting in the form of the question, because that's essentially, it doesn't lead anywhere, it doesn't do anything, it just sits there. You need that question to be integrated. You need to be able to choose the question already in some sense, and it needs to be in the process of being executed, in being done, in being served in some way. And that only comes if you can sort of do something to connect the question and the just itself have to occur through the activity of the inferior function of the ego, which is in some sense, I think you have to I think that the inferior function of the ego has to take responsibility for the child function of the superego, so that the inferior function essentially gets reborn as the dominant function in the superego. So you have to kind of merge the inferior function of the ego with the dominant function of the superego. You have to kind of teleport it into that place. And that requires a certain kind of conformity, and it also requires a certain kind of responsibility that the inferior function has to take for the just itself. But not all of it, but only some of the responsibility. In terms of, it needs to take full responsibility for the child function of the superego, but it doesn't take full responsibility for the dominant function because it becomes the dominant function. It actually merges it, and it actually with it, and it actually activates it with the impetus from the inferior function itself, and that is how you integrate that circuit essentially. But yeah. This is only possible if you have already done something with the prayer and the answer, because the prayer and the answer is the positive development of the non-integration of the inferior function. So the one is a reflection of the other. The condition of the answer and the prayer is the same condition as the inferior function with being disintegrated with the superego. So these things are like, the one is like a, the one is the microcosm, the other one is the macrocosm kind of thing. And so in some sense you need to be able to control the prayer, I would say, or change the answer by gradient scale, to be able to make the prayer malleable to the inferior function. Or at that point you could say to the inferior function or to the dominant function of the superego. Or at least the dominant function of the superego in league with the inferior function of the ego. And essentially that should fix the parent function of the superego. Then the parent function of the superego, because of that integration, should become detoxified. Okay. So the other thing is more important now, that I'm going to move on to, which is the subconscious and the ego itself. Because now I was just talking about the inferior function in the ego, but the actual foundation of the ego, its own local foundation, and the subconscious. This is the because in some sense the answer in the prayer might be the positive development side of the mind, which is itself very plugged into these things of the superego. It's very plugged into the shadow. The answer in the prayer is very plugged into the shadow. It's connected to this thing that's right at the seat of consciousness. All this free theta, the inferior function of the ego. But the subconscious and the ego is like a machine. It's like an automaton. It really is like the full identity of the false ego complex. That is just a kind of a sympathy mechanical kind of it's like a robot. So this robot has two informing things and two conforming things, and the two informing things are the declaration and the oath. And I think in some sense you could make a strong argument that the problem of the false ego complex is held within the declaration and the oath, and you could, for one reason or another, you could privilege the one over the other. You could say it's all the oath or it's all the declaration. And in some sense, in the past, I've actually said that it's all the declaration, because the subconscious is, because if you could just change the subconscious framework, then you could fix everything. And in some sense, the declaration is more basic than the oath. And that might still be the correct kind of way of looking at it. But you could also make an argument that the oath is also fundamentally the cause of all the problems, because it was the thing that developed first, I believe, most probably, is that the oath develops first, and it develops according to a kind of secret devotion. This might just be because I'm a Satwa, and it might be that Satwa starts off with devotion, oath, answer, prayer, declaration, worship, I think is the Sattvaic empirical flow chart. So this might just be because, so the first thing that a Sattva does, if my models are correct and my labeling of them is correct, that the Sattvaic individual is orientating their ego towards their subconscious foundation, is the first thing, which also means that they would have, I think that is perhaps what makes Sattva have the greatest clarity, is because their devotion is the first thing in their personality style. It has the highest coherence, because I think that in metagram circuitry, it can be seen as a kind of pecking order, that the first chain in the circuit is going to be the most well defined. It's going to be the most dignified, or the most sophisticated, the most well developed. And essentially, because theirs is the ego conforming to the subconscious foundation, it might, because I also have this other view, that because the oath is such a fundamentally important thing, how the ego is informing the unconscious inferior function to become its own edifice for its own local side of the mind, that the oath, when the false ego complex first develops, it has to be done with something in mind. It has to be done with some purpose or something like that. And I think that in some sense, I think that what everyone wants is they want their subconscious. They want a subconscious identity that has a certain power or attribute or feature. So they are gearing everything towards the declaration. They want to have a certain declaration. That's the point of the false ego complex, is to have an avatar in a game. It's like you're playing a game with your own sanity, and the point of playing this game is that you get to choose your avatar. You get to choose what you get to have. And so you want a certain declaration, but you have to play the game in order to achieve the performance of the role that you are trying to inhabit and play to. So you have to, at some point, you have to try to surmount an oath that is going to be commensurate with a certain kind of devotion that is going to land you up with a certain kind of declaration. So there's a kind of chess game that is being played against the declaration, and I call that kind of chess game, I'm going to call it the secret devotion, which is kind of like, like when you're baking bread, what people will do is they often won't keep on adding yeast to bread. They will already have dough that has yeast grown inside of it, and you'll get a bit of that. You'll get a bit of that dough that has already bacteria, already has the colony inside of it. You'll just get a start. You'll get a, I don't know. It's called a something starter. So, and you'll just mix that into the new dough that you're making. Now, I think that that's what's happening here with the secret devotion, is that the secret devotion is that inkling of what you want the declaration to be. And so the thing is that the ego's dominant function and the ego's parent function, perhaps predominantly the ego's parent function, has, at the very, very beginning of the development of the false ego complex, it has this secret devotion plan, which is being emulated, or is being used to start the oath. Because although in my circuitry the conformity happens before the informs, before how these things inform each other, at some point when you are beginning the false ego complex, there is no conformity to be had, because you need the information before you need the conformation of what is being informed. Anyway, I need to sharpen up this jargon, but that's basically the gist of it. And so I do think that the parent function of the ego has this historical guilt attached to it in terms of performing this false self-inception. Anyway, so the oath itself. Now, the reason why I'm talking so much about the oath and the declaration is because I think that this is where the particular. So, although at the beginning of the false ego complex you have this deep dishonesty in terms of how it was even contrived, how all of this stuff got off the ground. But once you've got the conformity running, once you've got the devotion and the worship functioning, the devotion being given by the dominant function and the parent function of the ego, and the worship being given by the dominant function and the parent function of the subconscious, you've got a kind of feedback loop that you're stuck in. And that feedback loop that you're stuck in, it has to do with a particular charge, which is to say that you have a mode of activity, you have a habitual use of cognitive functions, which is being triggered internally by a kind of symbolic interface with alchemical behavior, or that you're cogniting according to a kind of you are using cognitive implements which aren't even themselves authentic activities. They are symbols of activities, of mental activities. And what you really want to be able to do is you want to be able to fluidly change the information of the foundation of each side of the mind. You need to be able to have control over the oath and the declaration, essentially. And I would argue that you want that control to be linked to the inferior function of the ego, which should become an enlarged seat of consciousness and of direction and control of everything, as it is itself integrated into the dominant function of the superego, which is what I'd loosely call the New Jerusalem. And there are perhaps two ways of doing this, is that if you can change the worship and the devotion by gradient scale, if you can change the conformity of your subconscious dominant and parent function and the conformity of your ego dominant and parent function, but perhaps I think that the subconscious should be the thing that changes first, but that might also be a bias that I'm inheriting from being a Sattvic metagram personality style. Perhaps what it is that depending on if you're Sattva, Rajas, or Tamas, what you want to do is you want to work from the bottom up. You don't want to work from where you started your metagram chain. You want to work from the lowest rung in the pecking order. Anyway, I'm just somewhat speculating over a therapeutic strategy. But anyway, it is a kind of catch-22 on some level, because do you change? At some point, you have to get to the point where your dominant function and your parent function can change the information of its own foundation, of its own local side of the mind. And when it changes that information, that the conformity that is being offered to it is not going to upset the apple cart, but is going to be dynamic enough and fluid enough that the conformity is going to hold the bridge, essentially. Hold the bridge open in terms of a line of communication. So if you change the nature or the character of your declaration, that the devotion being offered to it by the ego is going to modulate itself accordingly. And that might be the hardest thing, because there's a secret devotion that also has to be counteracted or countermanded or dissolved or discharged. And what's weird is that that secret devotion, I mean, now I'm wildly speculating, but that secret devotion might have something to do with the superego child function. And it might be just a very sort of dark thing that was developed in the development of the false ego complex in the first place. But that it was, like the superego in general, that was shrouded in shadow and unconsciousness, because the secret devotion obviously gets in the way of the actual devotion and the actual conformity and informs that the circuitry is made up of, facilitating. Let me just add. I need to look at trying to get an explanation for the reason for this flow chart within metagram circuitry, but and I probably said some things that are very off base and just don't make any sense in terms of when I do, if I can crack this mystery. But I think that it might just be as simple as that someone's emotional tones are made up of cognitive functions that are made up of I haven't tested this in general, but I know that from my metagram circuit, the dominant function of the all of the emotional tones used in my circuitry correspond to dimensions, include, at least in each emotional tone, includes one dimension that falls into a dominant function or a parent function of each side of the mind. So there might be something as simple as that is the scaffolding around which anyway, sorry, this is just embarrassing talking about this stuff anyway.